Doc Holliday, the deadly doctor of the Old West, in the golden dust of legend, where truth is blurred by the smoke of revolvers and the passage of time, one name refuses to fade: Doc Holliday. Whispered in saloons, carved into books, and immortalized on the silver screen, his story is more than the tale of a man. It is the embodiment of a paradox, a riddle wrapped in gunsmoke and sealed with Southern charm. Was he a healer or a killer? A gentleman or a gambler? A man of honor or a harbinger of chaos? Perhaps he was all of these. For in the blood-soaked crucible of the American West, where law bent beneath the weight of lead and loyalty, John Henry Holliday emerged not just as a participant in its chaos, but as a symbol of its unforgiving poetry. He was a dentist by trade, trained in the fine science of saving lives, yet he would become famous for taking them. He wielded surgical tools with the same precision as a Colt revolver. Behind a gambler's deadpan and a gentleman's Southern drawl, there beat the heart of a man at war with himself. Not merely content with drifting through the West, Doc Holliday shaped it. His name rode beside Wyatt Earp, through blood and vengeance, through duty and brotherhood. His legend grew not only from what he did, but from what he refused to be. He would not apologize for who he was, nor yield to the world's expectations. This is not just a biography. It is an excavation into a man who lived as if every breath could be his last, and every bullet his eulogy. Born on August 14, 1851, in the sultry heart of Griffin, Georgia, Doc came into a world fractured by war and honor. He was the only surviving child of Henry Burroughs Holliday, a man forged by bloodshed and patriotic duty. Henry had marched under the burning sun of multiple wars, from skirmishes with the Cherokee to the brutality of the Mexican-American conflict and finally the Civil War. He returned home not only with medals, but with ghosts. Among them was a Mexican orphan named Francisco, brought back like a haunting reminder that the cost of war was more than measured in graves. Doc's mother, Alice Jane McKee, was the quiet strength of the family. Elegant, composed, and deeply devoted to her son. She gave John Henry more than life. She gave him grace. But tuberculosis, the grim reaper of the 19th century, came calling far too early. When Doc was just 15, Alice succumbed to the disease that would later stalk her son like a shadow. Her death was not just a tragedy. It was a fracture in the boy's soul. She had been his guiding light, and with her gone, the world grew colder, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. In the wake of her passing, Henry remarried within 3 months. To some, it was a practical decision. To young Doc, it was betrayal. This event, perhaps more than any bullet he would later dodge or fire, carved into him a permanent distrust of permanence. The boy who had once been a scholar of Greek and Latin, who recited French with ease and debated philosophy with precision, was now witness to life's arbitrary cruelty. If love could be replaced in weeks, what was sacred? If family could shift so quickly, what could be trusted? These weren't just the questions of a mourning child. They were the seeds of the man he would become. Before he was a legend with a pistol, Doc was a prodigy with a pen. The family's move to Valdosta, Georgia, would mark the beginning of his intellectual awakening. In a town dominated by cotton, politics, and Southern tradition, Henry Holliday became a pillar of the community. He served as mayor, a member of the Masonic Lodge, secretary of the local agricultural association, and a veteran figure whose influence reached deep into civic life. His presence was respected, his reputation ironclad. This stature extended to his son, who attended the Valdosta Institute and soaked in knowledge with the same intensity he would later bring to a poker table or a gunfight. Doc was no common Southern boy. He was steeped in classical education, able to read the words of Homer and Virgil in their native tongues. He knew French as intimately as he knew English. And behind that elegant mind, there stirred an anger, quiet, elegant, but real, the death of his mother, the cold speed of his father's remarriage. the rigidity of a Southern society that promised order but delivered heartbreak. These wounds were stitched with intellect but never healed. The man he would become, a gambler without apology, a killer with code, a friend unto death, was not created in the deserts of Arizona, nor in the smoky bars of Dodge City. He was born in drawing rooms and graveyards, in Latin declensions and tuberculosis wards. The world called him a villain, a drunk, a killer. But few saw the layers beneath the gunbelt and whiskey breath. Few saw the boy who reads Cicero, whose hands were trained to heal, who walked among Southern aristocracy before he walked into saloons. Doc Holliday was not a renegade by chance. He was a contradiction by design. This was a man who understood mortality in his bones, and chose to meet it not with fear, but with flair. And so, we begin our descent into the legend. This is not merely a tale of shootouts and smoky saloons. It is the story of a man standing in defiance of death, driven by ghosts of family, bound by fierce loyalty, and fueled by the knowledge that time was never on his side. You may know Doc Holliday as a killer, a gambler, a myth. But by the end of this story, you will see something more. The man behind the myth, the pain behind the poise, the brilliance behind the bullets. The West didn't just make him. He helped write its mythos, one dying breath at a time. By the time John Henry Holliday was standing on the threshold of adulthood, the innocence of youth had long since been carved out of him. The death of his mother in 1866 from tuberculosis was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a prophetic curse. The woman who had cradled his intellect, who had wrapped his early life in grace and affection, was taken from him by the very disease that would one day etch its cold breath into his lungs. Her death marked the end of warmth, and the world that followed was one of shadows. When his father, Henry Holliday, remarried just 3 months later, it shattered whatever lingering belief Doc may have had in stability or emotional permanence. That act, swift and without ceremony, became a psychological fault line that would shape his soul. For the rest of his life, Doc would drift between cities, games of chance and fleeting loyalties, as if always chasing something irretrievable, or perhaps running from what had already been lost. But before the West would claim him, the East would refine him. In 1870, Doc left Georgia and enrolled at the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery in Philadelphia, a city far removed from the Southern social rituals of his upbringing. There, he immersed himself in the study of anatomy, oral pathology, prosthodontics, subjects that demanded precision, delicacy, and discipline. He was not just a student. He was exemplary. He graduated at the age of 20, one of the youngest in his class, armed not only with credentials, but with a growing sense of irony. The same hands that would later be known for lightning-fast draws and fatal accuracy were first trained to repair and restore, to rebuild what life had broken. Returning to Georgia, Doc began practicing dentistry in Atlanta under the mentorship of Dr. Arthur Seaford. Together, they provided treatments in an era when painkillers were rudimentary, and a steady hand meant the difference between recovery and agony. Doc's charm, eloquence, and education made him popular among clients. But beneath the professional polish, a storm was gathering. His persistent cough, dry, sharp, and worsening, was more than an annoyance. It was the drumbeat of approaching death. The diagnosis came like a sentence: consumption, the common term for tuberculosis. A death warrant disguised as a diagnosis. The young dentist had inherited not only his mother's gentleness, but also the illness that had devoured her. For most, that would have been the end. But for Doc Holliday, it was the beginning of something else entirely. With no cure in sight, his physicians advised him to seek drier air, a climate that might prolong his life, if not save it. He packed up his instruments and dreams and headed west, toward the unknown horizon of Texas, the last outpost before the chaos of the frontier. There, in Dallas, he tried to restart. He partnered with Dr. John Seeger, a friend of his father's and fellow dentist. Together, They showcased their skills at the North Texas Agricultural, Mechanical and Bloodstock Association Fair, winning awards for dental excellence, best gold teeth, best vulcanized rubber set, best artificial denture work. But even as he was being celebrated professionally, his body betrayed him. His cough worsened. The fever returned in waves. Holding instruments became a chore. Focusing on procedures required an iron will. Eventually, something snapped. Maybe it was the knowledge that he was dying. Maybe it was the futility of resisting the inevitable. Or maybe it was just the call of the West, a place where rules bent, lives were gambled, and a man could redefine himself. Slowly, Doc began shifting away from dentistry and into gambling, a transition that felt less like a fall and more like a transformation. The card table became his new office, the poker chip his scalpel, the revolver his final instrument. He became a dealer of faro, a game of high stakes and higher tempers. With every deal, he was reading men, dissecting them with his eyes the way he once examined molars and jawlines. And when the game turned sour, as it often did, Doc didn't flinch. In 1875, the transformation became irreversible. A confrontation in a Dallas saloon with a tavern owner named Austin turned violent. Tempers flared, insults gave way to bullets, and though no one died that night, the gunfire marked a turning point. It was the first recorded gunfight involving Doc Holliday, and it wouldn't be the last. Just days later, another conflict escalated further. This time, a man died from 2 precision shots, both delivered by Doc. The details were blurred in the reports, but the outcome was clear. Holliday was now a wanted man. Fleeing the law, he headed deeper into the untamed lands of Jacksboro, Texas, a place teetering between civilization and savagery, nestled near a military outpost where danger was part of the daily air. There, Doc found work once more as a faro dealer, his reputation growing alongside his arsenal. He wore a revolver on his hip, another in a shoulder holster, and carried a knife strapped to his chest. His image was unmistakable, a thin, pale figure, eyes sunken from illness, yet burning with defiance. A ghost dressed as a gentleman. Violence became routine. Within a short period, he was involved in 3 more shootouts. Though none resulted in death, they left a message. Doc Holliday was not to be underestimated. But the real turning point, the one that put a target on his back, came when he killed a soldier from Fort Richardson. The exact circumstances remain clouded in conflicting accounts, but the consequences were immediate. The United States government launched an investigation. A bounty was placed on his head. The Army, Texas Rangers, local sheriffs, and even opportunistic civilians began hunting him, eager to collect the reward. Doc became a fugitive, hunted not just by men, but by time, illness, and the weight of his own legend, which was already beginning to take shape in the whispers of taverns and the pages of wanted posters. Despite the growing danger around him, Holliday still clung to traces of his old life. In Dallas, before the law closed in, he had teamed once more with Dr. Seeger, entering and winning awards at local fairs. Their dental work was still admired, still celebrated, but Holliday was already living with one foot in the underworld. Tuberculosis had not only robbed him of breath, but of future. He began gambling in earnest, turning away from medical instruments and toward playing cards, whiskey glasses, and revolvers. In May of 1874, a grand jury indicted Doc and a dozen others for illegal gambling. For many, such a charge would be a warning. For Holliday, it was a declaration. His descent into the criminal underworld wasn't a stumble. It was a chosen path. Not because he craved violence, but because he saw no alternative. The professional world he had once excelled in no longer had space for a man who coughed blood between patients. The genteel society that once praised his manners now recoiled from the disease etched in his lungs. And so he embraced the edge, because the edge at least felt real. What followed was not the story of a criminal, but of a man who refused to surrender to fate. He would not die in a hospital bed. He would not be forgotten in a ledger of lost causes. If he was doomed, then he would go out in fire, not silence. The boy from Georgia, who once read Virgil and spoke fluent French, was now becoming a myth, one hand on a whiskey bottle, the other never far from his revolver. And though death shadowed his every step, it would have to catch him first. Some say the deadliest thing in the West wasn't the bullet, it was loneliness. Amid the dust, the blood, the deals made over poker tables, and the silences between coughs, Doc Holliday carried within him a wound far deeper than any from a pistol. He knew death intimately, welcomed it with a gambler's smirk, and yet, behind the bravado and bourbon, there lingered a hunger not for violence, but for connection. And then came her, a storm in petticoats, sharp-tongued, whip-smart, and as wild as he was. Mary Catherine Heroni, known across the territories as Big Nose Kate, wasn't just another woman passing through a saloon. She was, in every way that mattered, Doc Holliday's match and possibly his salvation. She was Hungarian by birth, educated in Europe, fluent in multiple languages, and carved from the same stone as the men who survived the frontier. She had walked away from social convention, from polite society, and from any man who thought he could tame her. In the rough saloons and gambling dens of the West, where women were often relegated to background roles or used as currency in backroom trades, Kate stood apart. She chose her life, and she chose Doc. Their meeting in Fort Griffin, Texas, was less romance and more recognition. Two broken souls with sharp edges, each too clever, too wounded, too damned to ever be normal. She worked as a prostitute when it suited her, not out of desperation, but defiance. The life gave her freedom. It gave her autonomy, and Doc, he didn't judge her. In a world where respect was bought with bullets, and loyalty was measured in who stood beside you when the lead started flying, Kate was there. Again and again. When his illness flared, when the law circled in, when his temper eclipsed reason, she was there. Not as a damsel, but as a co-conspirator in whatever misadventure came next. Their relationship was not a gentle one. It was combustion, pure and relentless. They fought like wolves, fiercely publicly. There were moments of violence, rumors of knives drawn in rage, threats made and withdrawn. But they also returned to each other like tide to shore. She's the only woman ever known to have held Doc's heart, the only one he ever confided in, trusted, and perhaps even feared. Kate wasn't just in his life. She was part of his myth. And if he was destined to burn out, then she would be there, fanning the flame or holding the bottle. Their bond was tested more than once. When authorities sought to pin a stagecoach robbery on Doc, it was Kate who, in a moment of fury after an argument, allegedly turned him in, only to retract her statement later, claiming it was all fabricated. Whether it was revenge or manipulation, it didn't matter. The message was clear. She knew how to wound him like no one else, but he forgave her. He always did. Because for a man who saw the world as a fleeting hand of cards, Kate was the one constant that kept returning to the table. And yet, even love wasn't enough to shield a man like Holliday from destiny. Enter Wyatt Earp, a figure equal in myth and gravity, a lawman with a gunslinger's calm and a code of honor written in gunpowder. Their paths would cross in Dodge City, a town that stood as the last civilized checkpoint before the full madness of the frontier. It was here that legend says their friendship was born in smoke and defiance. Accounts vary. The papers were silent, and history left it mostly unrecorded, but that only amplified the myth. Some say the incident unfolded in the Long Branch Saloon, where a gang of rowdy cowboys, led by outlaws previously run out of Wichita, stormed the establishment, terrorizing patrons and preparing to lay hands on Earp. Wyatt stood alone, confronted, outnumbered. And then, from the back of the room, Doc stood up. He didn't hesitate. He pulled his revolver and pointed it squarely at the ringleader's head, demanding disarmament. It wasn't theatrical, it was surgical. A man already dying had no reason to fear another fight. In that moment, he didn't save just Wyatt's life. He declared loyalty, the kind of loyalty you don't buy, beg, or borrow. It's earned once. And from that instant forward, Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp were brothers in everything but blood. The story went unprinted, but not unnoticed. Word spread through whispered awe. A sickly gambler, half dead, stepping into the breach to protect a man of the law? It didn't make sense, unless you understood the code that bound the two. In a land where shifting alliances ruled, where men shook hands before stabbing backs, Doc and Wyatt forged something rare and unbreakable. They were opposites in so many ways. Earp was composed, methodical, a man who measured his violence. Doc was chaos wrapped in charm, an explosion barely contained behind a southern accent. Yet they moved together with uncanny synergy. Where one led, the other followed. When Wyatt needed a gun, Doc brought two. When Doc needed a reason to fight beyond himself, Wyatt gave him one. Their friendship transcended legality. Wyatt never cared about Doc's past, the deaths, the gambling, the drinking, the illness. He saw the man beneath it, a loyal fighter, a strategist, and perhaps the most fearless ally he would ever have. And Doc? For all his misanthropy and bravado, he respected Wyatt's steadiness. He believed in him, maybe more than he ever believed in himself. Together, they would go on to write chapters of Western legend. From the dusty alleys of Tombstone to the courtroom battles that followed the OK Corral, they stood shoulder to shoulder, not for law, not for glory, but for each other. In Doc's world, where time was measured in wheezing breaths and whiskey shots, Wyatt Earp was anchor and compass. And to Wyatt, Doc was more than a gun. He was a man who would walk into hell with him, smiling, coughing, and ready to die for a cause he didn't even believe in, so long as Wyatt believed in it. In Big Nose Kate and Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday found the two constants his drifting soul never expected. A woman who burned like fire, and a brother who stood like stone. These were not companions, they were the twin mirrors of his soul. One showed him who he was, the other who he could have been. And between them, he navigated the final ferocious years of a life lived not in years, but in legendary moments. Love and loyalty. Passion and principle. In the end, these were the only things that mattered to a man already half in the grave. And Doc Holliday, the gambler dying of consumption, the dentist turned desperado, the killer with a code, he died knowing he had both. The desert sun had not yet reached its zenith on October 26, 1881, when destiny sharpened its blade in a town called Tombstone. There, amidst the dry wind and the echo of boots on gravel, history prepared to write one of its most enduring chapters in blood and thunder. The streets of Tombstone were no stranger to violence. They pulsed with it, thrived on it. But nothing that had come before could match what was about to unfold in the alley off Fremont Street. On that fateful day, a 30-second exchange of gunfire between 8 men would ignite a legend, destroy lives, and bind the names of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday to the eternal mythos of the American West. Tensions had been building for weeks. The so-called Cowboys, a loose confederation of outlaws, rustlers, and killers, had long operated in the region with impunity. Their rivalry with the Earp brothers, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan, had evolved from a simmering grudge into an open powder keg. Cattle rustling, stagecoach robberies, intimidation of townsfolk. The Cowboys were more than local thugs. They were a symptom of a larger war for control of Tombstone, a clash between law and lawlessness, civilization and frontier savagery. Doc Holliday, never one to ignore a storm, was already neck-deep in the Earp's cause. He didn't carry a badge, but his loyalty was ironclad. When Virgil Earp, the acting U.S. Marshal, received word that several armed cowboys, including Ike and Billy Clanton, Frank and Tom McClory, were gathered near the OK Corral, flaunting the town's strict no-weapons ordinance, he knew a confrontation was inevitable. Wyatt and Morgan prepared for war. And beside them, coughing blood into his handkerchief, was Doc Holliday, pale as the dust beneath their boots, but ready to kill. Accounts differ on the exact location. Some say the lot behind the OK Corral, others cite the narrow space beside C.S. Fly's photography studio. What is certain is this: at around 3 p.m., the Earp party approached the armed cowboys, intending to disarm them. Virgil carried a cane and a shotgun. Wyatt had his revolver. Morgan was tense. Doc, ever the theatrical soul, was said to be wearing a long coat concealing a shotgun, and a smirk that unsettled even hardened men. The moment cracked open with a voice. Perhaps it was Wyatt telling them to throw up their hands. Perhaps it was Doc delivering a dry, venom-laced threat. No one agrees on who fired first. But in less than 30 seconds, more than 30 rounds were discharged. When the smoke cleared, Billy Clanton, Tom McClory, and Frank McClory lay dead. Virgil and Morgan Earp were wounded. Holliday, though struck by a glancing shot, remained standing, his weapon still hot. The Cowboys had been outgunned, outmaneuvered, and outclassed by a team with nothing to lose. The death toll was swift, brutal, and final. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The townsfolk, divided in their loyalties, cried foul. Some claimed the Earp faction had murdered the Cowboys in cold blood. Others saw it as a justified act of law enforcement. A formal murder charge was brought against Wyatt and Doc, and the courtroom became the next battleground. The hearing was tense, its outcome uncertain. Witnesses contradicted themselves. Accusations flew like bullets. Doc, ever defiant, never wavered. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He simply existed, the same way he always had, as a force of nature dressed in a gentleman's coat. Ultimately, Judge Will Spicer ruled the killings justified. The Earps and Holliday were absolved of murder, declared to have acted within the bounds of their duties as peace officers or their proximity to such authority. But exoneration didn't bring peace. The Cowboys had friends, brothers, allies. Blood had been spilled. Retaliation was inevitable. That vengeance came swiftly. On March 18, 1882, Morgan Earp was gunned down in cold blood while playing billiards. A bullet pierced his back, exited through his stomach. He died in Wyatt's arms. The war had returned, this time far more personal. And if the OK Corral was a clash of factions, what followed was a vendetta. Wyatt Earp, once a measured lawman, abandoned any pretense of justice and became a reaper in leather boots. With Doc at his side, he set out to hunt down every man connected to Morgan's death. No trials, no arrests. Just reckoning. Frank Stillwell was the first, cornered near a train station in Tucson, shot and left for dead. Then came Curly Bill Brocious, a feared killer and ringleader of the Cowboys. During a gun battle in Iron Springs, Wyatt gunned him down at point-blank range, shotguns roaring like thunder. The killings continued. Each name crossed off the list like lines in a grim ledger. And always Doc was there, sick, gaunt, burning from within, but fighting like a man already dead, which made him the most dangerous of all. But it wasn't just Stillwell and Brocious who loomed in their sights. There was one more name, whispered more than spoken, a specter wrapped in cunning and calculation: Johnny Ringo. Ringo was no mere thug. He was educated, eloquent, and lethal. A man of contradictions, much like Doc himself. Some said he was a poet with a pistol, a thinker with a blood-stained past. Others claimed he was madness wrapped in civility. What is certain is that he and Holliday were on a collision course, two burning stars destined to either annihilate or be extinguished. The story of Johnny Ringo's death is as tangled in myth as anything in the annals of the Old West. What we know: on July 14, 1882, Ringo was found dead beneath a large oak tree in the Chiricahua Mountains, a bullet to the head. His revolver still in its holster, his boots removed. The scene was both haunting and suspicious. A man known for his vigilance found defenseless, alone, and very much dead. The official verdict? Suicide, but few believed it. Whispers spread like wildfire. Ringo had met Holliday in a secret duel, a final showdown between intellect and illness, fury and finesse. The notion thrilled Western storytellers. Holliday, dying, seeking one last victory before the darkness took him. Ringo, ruthless and proud, finally meeting someone he couldn't outwit or outgun. The duel supposedly ended with one shot. Doc walking away, Ringo crumpled like an empty coat. The theory made sense to those who craved symmetry. It fit the myth. Two icons locked in a final dance, with fate drawing the curtain. But the timeline refused to cooperate. Contemporary records placed Doc Holliday in Colorado on July 7th, a full week before Ringo's death. He was seen in Salida, hundreds of miles away, and then in Leadville on July 18th. Could he have traveled down, committed the act, and returned unnoticed? Perhaps, but no witness ever stepped forward, no confession was made. And Doc, ever theatrical, never claimed the kill. And if there was one thing about Doc Holliday, it was this: if he had shot Johnny Ringo in fair combat, he would have told someone. And so, the death of Ringo remains one of the West's great mysteries. Suicide? Murder? A rival's vengeance, or a soul cracking under the weight of its own contradictions? We'll never know. Ringo's boots, removed before death, remain the most unsettling clue, a tradition in some cultures, a sign of peace or surrender. Or perhaps the killer removed them, one final insult to a dying legend. Or perhaps Ringo removed them himself, finally laying down his arms, not to fight another man, but to fight his own demons no longer. As for Doc, whether he was responsible or not, the myth tied him to the act like a blood-stained ribbon. To this day, when Western historians gather, they still argue, did Holliday kill Ringo? Did the gambler's final card trump the outlaw's last move? Or did Ringo, alone and tired, simply give in to a life he could no longer carry? One thing is certain, in the tale of the OK Corral and in the death of Johnny Ringo, Doc Holliday was always at the center of the storm, a ghost who walked with death not as an enemy, but as a companion. And whether he pulled the trigger or not, his legend only grew, whispering across the canyons and into history, that of a man who never feared the end because he had been dancing with it all along. By the time the year 1887 turned its weary page to autumn, Doc Holliday had already burned through the years most men would have stretched across a lifetime. He had outdueled fate in saloons, escaped the gallows more than once, buried enemies and friends alike, and carved his name into the marrow of Western legend. But now, the man once feared across the frontier was no longer riding into towns with fire in his lungs. He was fleeing the embers, seeking something far more elusive than vengeance or fame. He was chasing peace, or perhaps the faintest hope of survival in a body long betrayed by its own breath. The destination was Glenwood Springs, Colorado, a place whispered about among the sick as a haven of healing waters and dry mountain air. They spoke of the Yampa hot springs, of sulfur vapors that could clear lungs and rebalance humors. It was there, in the shadow of the Rockies, that men and women riddled with consumption went not necessarily to live, but to delay the inevitable. Doc Holliday, who had faced bullets, bounty hunters, and the specter of the noose without blinking, now turned to steam and superstition, chasing one last gamble in a high-stakes game he could not win. He arrived at the Glenwood Hotel in May of that year, a shell of the man who once silenced rooms with a glance. No longer carrying pistols under his coat, he now leaned on a cane. His once razor-cut cheekbones were now gaunt, hollowed by years of coughing and blood. The southern drawl remained, but the fire behind his eyes flickered low. His hands, once steady enough to split playing cards with lead, trembled now from fever and exhaustion. He checked into a room on the second floor, not with the confidence of a gunfighter, but with the resignation of a man stepping into the last chapter of his legend. For 57 days, he remained confined to that room, his body growing weaker by the hour. The sulfur-rich vapors, praised by the hopeful, did little for him. Every breath was a battle. The coughs came in racking fits, each one a reminder that the enemy in his chest was not impressed by the name Holliday. And yet, even in those walls, far from Tombstone, far from Wyatt Earp, far from the sound of gunfire and galloping hooves, Doc remained Doc. He played cards when he could, drank what little whiskey he was allowed, and kept his wit sharp enough to slice a throat. He was not waiting for death. He was daring it to come knock on the door. It's said that for 14 of those final days, he drifted in and out of delirium, haunted by visions only the dying can see. At times he muttered names, some of them known, some lost to history. Wyatt, Kate, Johnny Ringo, his mother. The voices of past lives danced through his fevered mind, their silhouettes rising like smoke in the corners of the room. A nurse once claimed he reached for a revolver that wasn't there, cursing a man who hadn't existed in 20 years. Another day, he laughed for no reason, then wept silently into his pillow. These weren't the ravings of a madman. They were the echoes of a life lived too fast, too hard, too full of ghosts. But death did not come with trumpets or gunpowder. There was no duel at dawn, no final standoff in a dusty street. In the end, Doc Holliday died quietly in a room filled with sulfur steam and mountain wind. And perhaps that was the cruelest irony of all. On the morning of November 8, 1887, the storm calmed. The fever broke. The coughing stopped. For the first time in days, Doc opened his eyes, clear, focused, aware. The pain that had etched itself into his every breath was momentarily gone. The room was still. A nurse approached him, expecting perhaps a final prayer or a whispered name. Instead, Doc, eyes twinkling with the last flicker of mischief, asked for a glass of whiskey. He sipped it slowly, savoring the burn like an old friend returned. Then he looked down at his bare feet, stared for a moment in silence, and smiled. "That's funny," he said. And then, with a faint chuckle still hanging in the air, he died. It was a death that defied every prediction, especially his own. Doc had lived with the certainty that he would die in violence, likely in the arms of Wyatt Earp or on the blood-soaked floor of some frontier dive. He believed his lungs wouldn't be the thing to kill him. It would be lead, cold, fast, glorious. He imagined his last breath coming with a pistol in hand, not a whiskey glass. And yet, it ended not with a gunshot, but a laugh. Those two final words, "That's funny," became more than his epitaph. They became a final act of defiance, a wink to the world that had labeled him an outlaw, a killer, a drunk, a lost soul. In the end, he had proven them all wrong. He died not in fire, but in irony. And that, to a man like Holliday, was a victory all its own. His body was buried in Glenwood Springs Cemetery, perched high on a hill above the valley, where the wind still sings through the pines and the mountains keep eternal watch. Some say the exact location of his grave is uncertain, another ghost in a life built on myths. Others believe his soul never settled, that he walks still in stories, in saloons, in the sudden silence that falls when his name is mentioned. What is certain is this: Doc Holliday became more than a man. He became an archetype. And yet, what makes his final days so haunting isn't just that he died. It is how he lived knowing he would. Every decision, every step, every fight, every love, every betrayal, all of it filtered through the lens of a man who had death riding his shoulders since his early 20s. Consumption wasn't just an illness to him. It was a reminder that life, real life, is borrowed time. And he intended to spend every last second like a man who refused to owe anything to fate. He didn't waste his illness in mourning. He weaponized it, walking into rooms where other men hesitated. He gambled with death, not because he had a death wish, but because he had nothing left to fear. What can a bullet do to a man who already coughs blood? What can the law threaten to someone who's already been condemned by nature? In this, he was untouchable, not immortal, just unafraid. When Wyatt Earp heard of Doc's death, it said he sat in silence for a long time. No tears, just silence. And perhaps that's the most fitting tribute. Because Wyatt knew something the world would take decades to understand. Doc Holliday wasn't a villain. He wasn't a hero. He was something far more rare, a man who lived true to himself until the very end. And now, the wind that blows through Glenwood Springs does not carry the sound of gunfire, but of legacy. The thunder is gone, the fever has passed. And the man who once looked death in the face every day now lies in quiet defiance, whispering across eternity. That's funny. In the high country of Colorado, perched above the town of Glenwood Springs, lies a cemetery wrapped in silence and snow. There, among weathered gravestones and whispering pine trees, rests the body of a man whose life refused to be quiet. John Henry Holliday, known to the world as Doc, lies buried beneath the sky he once defied. A man whose bones are still, but whose legend continues to ride across the plains of time. His grave, marked by stone and mystery, is more than a burial site. It is a monument to defiance, loyalty, and the relentless fire of a soul that would not bow. He was supposed to die young, and he did. But not before outliving 9 separate attempts on his life, 4 attempted hangings, 5 gunshot wounds, and an illness that killed thousands every year. He lived longer than the men who hunted him, outlasted the laws that sought him, and left a deeper mark on history than most who walked the path of lawfulness. Each near death was not just survival, it was a middle finger to the very notion of fate. For a man born with death at his back, every breath was an act of rebellion, and rebellion became legacy. Doc Holliday's story was never meant to end at a headstone. It was never about the cough or the bullets or the bourbon. It was about the fire in his eyes, the code in his chest, the unshakable loyalty that led him to walk into gunfights not for money, not for fame, but for friendship. His life was a mosaic of contradictions. A trained doctor turned killer, a southern gentleman with a gambler's nerve, a dying man who stood taller in danger than most men ever did in health. And in those contradictions, he became a legend. His legend began with the people who knew him, Wyatt Earp, who would speak of him with awe and sorrow until his dying day. The lawmen and outlaws alike who respected his steel. The women who saw past the sharp tongue to the wounded heart beneath. And then came the writers, the historians, the filmmakers, all of them trying to bottle the lightning that was Doc Holliday. They painted him in every shade, tragic, heroic, villainous, mythic, but none could truly capture him. Because Doc wasn't just a man, he was a question with no answer. In novels, he walks with a slow, deliberate gait, quoting Latin between gunshots. In films, he's immortalized with southern charm and a devilish grin, always one step ahead of death. From Victor Mature to Val Kilmer, generations of actors have chased the spirit of Holliday across the screen, but none have owned it, because no one owns a ghost. He has become as much a symbol as he was a person, the epitome of what it means to live without apology, to face the end with a drink in your hand and a joke on your lips. In every corner of the Western mythos, Doc's shadow looms. In dusty video games, in television series, in countless books and documentaries, his story is retold not because it's dramatic, but because it feels eternal. He represents a version of the West that never truly died, the wild edge of law and chaos, the narrow space where friendship matters more than badges, and where courage isn't about health, it's about heart. Yet even in the silence of the cemetery, his legend hasn't aged. It only echoes louder. Tourists still hike to his resting place, leaving coins, cigars, and whiskey at his grave. Some leave notes. Others leave nothing at all, just standing there in silence, imagining the man who once made enemies shake and allies stand taller. They don't come to mourn, they come to pay tribute. Because Doc Holliday didn't just survive his era. He transcended it. And maybe that's the most haunting part of his legacy. He never wanted to be remembered. He didn't write letters to historians. He didn't pose for portraits to decorate books. He didn't fight for glory. He fought for his friends, for his beliefs, for whatever pieces of honor he could salvage from a world that had stolen so much from him. And in doing so, he carved a space for himself among the immortals. When we remember Doc Holliday, we don't just recall the gunfights or the tuberculosis. We remember the loyalty, the wit, the rage, the elegance under pressure. We remember a man who had every reason to lie down, but chose, instead, to stand up, again and again. Even when he could barely breathe. Even when he knew it would end in blood. Because to Doc, it wasn't about how long he lived. It was about how fiercely. He taught us something rare. That resilience isn't strength without weakness. It's strength in spite of it. That passion isn't always loud. Sometimes it coughs between sentences and keeps walking forward. That purpose isn't some distant dream. It's found in every choice to rise when everything hurts. Doc Holliday didn't die with a grand final act of violence. He died with a smirk. With irony. With one last sip of whiskey and a final word that turned the silence into poetry. And maybe that's the most fitting end of all. Because if there's one thing the legend of Doc Holliday reminds us of, it's this: death comes for us all. But not all of us face it like him. If this story moved you, if it made you see not just a legend, but the man beneath it, the one who lived fast, loved hard, and died on his own terms, then consider liking this video. It helps the channel reach more people who love true stories told with passion and respect. Subscribe so you don't miss the next tale of history's boldest lives. And turn on notifications so you're always the first to ride into the next great story with us. And if you feel like it, drop a comment below. From which city and country are you watching us? Thanks for riding with us to the very end. Until next time, remember, it's not how long you live. It's how well you aim.